a special edition of The Front Bench. Two people who have been around that Premier's table before. Former BC Premier Christy Clark, she's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones now, and former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO of Space Canada. Hi to both of you. Thanks so much for making the time for this. Brian, I'll start with you. How normal is it that the healthcare focus of this, it was supposed to be a healthcare summit, gets overtaken by the kind of dominant political story being the carbon tax in this case?
Super normal. That's normal in politics in general, as everybody on this panel certainly knows. The people that would like to have a message get across certainly don't always get that message out there, or is certainly not necessarily carried as much as they would. So in politics, that's super normal. When it comes to these types of meetings, it's also pretty typical too. Obviously, if there's something happening and something that's boiling over, which is certainly the case right now nationally, and even more specifically with the federal government, you obviously risk having that be the focus of media, focus of sort of the conversations around the table, whether it be formally or informally. And what I mean by that, whether it kind of seeps its way into the agenda as it has in this case, or it sort of informally, meaning that after the kind of in between the coffee breaks and all this stuff and with media and the scrums, this is the topic that comes up. So you can see that Premier Houston would like to talk about healthcare for, I think, evident reasons for those that have followed his sort of success in his campaign. He focused on healthcare, wants to deliver, so he definitely wants that to be the message, but that's just probably not going to be the case.
How significant, Christy, do you think it is that all the premiers, who I should point out come from different political parties in this meeting, were able to come to the same conclusion in asking the feds to expand what they did for heating oil that primarily impacts Atlantic Canada to cover other heat sources that would impact the rest of the country? Is it a big deal that the premiers agree on that?
I don't know if it's an unexpected outcome. Premiers, strangely, get around the table, and despite the political differences between them, you do find a lot of things that premiers have in common. And the reason is because all premiers fundamentally chafe when you have an interventionist federal government, which is frankly overreaching its authority under the Constitution. And we've seen a recent court decision that slapped the federal government's hand for that. So, I mean, provincial governments want to keep the federal government out of what is provincial business. Second, provincial premiers all want to be seen to be fighting for their constituents, and nobody is more concerned about the increasing cost of living politically than premiers at the moment. I think it's sort of something that the federal government doesn't really see as close to home. They don't really think about it the same way. And I think the third thing is, when one province is getting special treatment, or one set of provinces is getting special treatment, premiers know that it is incredibly divisive and bad for the country, and you cannot responsibly, I don't think, lead this country if you're going to give some deals to some provinces you happen to need or prefer or like, and not give those deals to others.
Brian, we'll talk about the kind of implications for the federal government in a second, but I wanted to pick up on the second point Christy made there around the kind of political imperative that the affordability crisis has created for premiers, because I will say, for every single premier I interviewed, NDP, Conservative, you name it, during the day, that is when you're asking them why they've taken the position they have, you can tell that affordability politically is the biggest thing that they're dealing with right now. And I'm wondering, to what degree do you think that ends up informing all the kinds of things they end up pushing the feds on, including this?
Yeah, it will definitely be right at the center of the way in which they approach this meeting and what they hope will come out of this. Now, again, Premier Houston, who's the host, for those that are sort of tuning in to try to catch what the dynamics are around that table. So he's the host, so he is definitely sort of the one kind of figuratively holding the pen, so trying to make it a little bit more about healthcare for the reasons we already discussed. But other than that, there's no doubt that affordability will be at the center of everything that they're going to have on their agenda and what comes out of these meetings. And I agree with what Christy said. I think that provincial politicians are certainly very close to the people, just by the nature of the work and the jurisdictions that they have. The federal government, obviously, they have larger ridings. The MPs certainly represent more people. And I mean, look, there's a lot going on in the world too. So there has been a lot on the plate for the federal government that's a little bit more macro, that's a little bit more global affairs focused. So obviously, I think that they recognize that affordability is an issue. And I think we saw the kind of pivot point or that recognition sort of in July when the Trudeau government tried to sort of really sort of get off the mat and show that they're resetting. And I think that was very much because they recognize that affordability is a real issue for Canadians, and also because they can see what the outcome is in the polls.
Christy, maybe just jumping off of that, the million or billions dollar question is whether or not, and just based on your experience and Brian's, the Premier's coalescing around an issue does have a tangible political impact on the federal government. Do you think the Premier saying to them, hey, we want this carve-out expanded, is going to make, for example, as much of an impact as the Atlantic Caucus lobbying them fervently about doing the same thing?
I think so. I mean, the federal government never wants to look like it's fully at war with the provinces, although we've certainly had a few prime ministers that didn't seem to mind that too much. And Justin Trudeau has really shown that he's got some provinces that are really his favorites and some that are not. And, I'm thinking about attacking Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular here. But, one thing that is really bad for the country, and I think the most important job of any prime minister, is divisiveness. Prime Minister's job is to hold the country together. He or she is the only person tasked with keeping Canada united. And I think premiers feel that threat of divisiveness very deeply and really worry about the long-term impact that that'll have on being able to keep our country together. I mean, the thing is they are also first ministers. They want to be respected members of the table. And with the federal government seeming to disrespect most of the premiers in the country with this decision, they've really got their backs up. I think it's gotten a little bit personal.
I want to put the same question to you, Brian. Do you think that the Premier's coalescing will have a tangible political impact on the feds?
Let me start by just addressing the idea that they're coalescing around the idea, around this sort of ask. I think it's usually pretty easy for the premiers, and we, Christy and I, have sat around that table too, and sort of came to, I'm sure, similar conclusions when we were all there. It's kind of easier to ask the feds for something more than it is probably to do anything else around that table. So look, there's great work that happens, don't get me wrong, but one of the easier things to coalesce around is having the 13 premiers say, yeah, the federal government could be doing more. It's not as thorny of a debate when that's sort of what's on the table. So in this case, if you're one of the 4 Atlantic premiers, and the arguments are that, whether you agree with them or you don't agree with them, they can say, well, look, we got what we were hoping to get, some relief, but not paraphrasing, of course, not saying that that's what all the premiers in Atlantic Canada are saying, but nevertheless, we sort of got something, let's put it that way. And if the federal government does more and helps other provinces, we're okay with that, right? It's not, to Christy's earlier point, I mean, people that are premiers care about Canada very much, so they want to see other provinces and territories doing well. So that's probably an easier thing to coalesce around than maybe some of the other thornier issues that that table has to deal with.
Vassy, the federal government's playbook with this stuff, with
yeah,
premiers, and Brian and I experienced this, is when the premiers kind of agree on something, the feds go in and try and peel off a few premiers who are going to then do a side deal, and then they can divide the premiers. This doesn't look like that's going to happen. The reason they try and do it is because it really works to divide the premiers. Then they can come across looking like the good guy. In those rare occurrences when they can't peel anybody off, that's when they know they have a big problem on their hands. And I think they see that now.
Right. So that leads me to my final question, and maybe each of you can take 20 seconds to weigh in. Is there any way politically for the Prime Minister now to say, okay, we will expand this?
No.
Brian, I'll let you go first. Sorry. Okay. Christy didn't need 20 seconds.
Christy already gave hers. Yeah. Well, look, I think that they put themselves in a bit of a difficult spot. And to your earlier question, yes, I do think that the Premier is getting around the table and saying, yeah, you should do what you did for Atlantic Canada for other provinces or something similar, will carry some weight in this case because it will be an argument of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll leave
I
it
just
there. Christy and Brian, thank you. Oh, never mind. Go ahead. Yeah, that's okay. You got 20 more seconds. It's all good. Go ahead.
I don't think they can do it because they said they wouldn't do it. They promised they wouldn't do it. They're supposed to care about climate change. They're worried about the NDP vote that they normally get into their column. It would be very risky for them to take the Premier's advice on this politically.
Okay. For real this time, I'm going to add. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, Brian. Christy Clark and Brian Gallant. Appreciate the discussion, a special edition of The Front Bench.